Chapter 8 of The 8th Illinois by W. T. Good. This is recorded to celebrate the 8th anniversary of LibriVox. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 8 Courage Knows No Color. The will to do brave deeds to neither clime nor color owes its birth. Courageous souls are ever white as God's effulgent ray, which touched them into life. The 8th Illinois Volunteer Infantry, which went to the front, enlisted with the ardor of patriots, born of the desire to fight for the country that had given them freedom and protection; to show that they, too, could fight for the cause of liberty, and finally, in aid of the suffering victims of the tyranny of Spain. The colored soldiers of Illinois went forth, not to war against the Spanish soldiers, but against an enemy more dreaded and more decimating to the ranks of the American soldiers who fought in Cuba. Their ready response in the very face of death was in itself an evidence of heroism which should win the gratitude of every citizen of the state and country. They showed that the same spirit, quickened sense of patriotism, and loyalty to the flag inspires men of all colors and conditions. When the brave soldiers of the 8th went to war against "Yellow Jack" in Cuba, there was uppermost in their minds the one thing or thought to show their white liberators that they could offer their life blood as willingly as did the soldiers in the Civil War. The regiment went to Cuba with as much peril ahead as was encountered by the 9th and 10th colored cavalrymen and the 24th and 25th infantries, colored, which dashed up the heights of San Juan and nobly helped carry the day. These colored troops, who did more to elevate the race in the estimation of the world than any other event in its history, encountered a storm of bullets, but the 8th Illinois had the fatal germs of fever to combat and great hardships to endure. Illinois will receive a great share of credit given by historians of the future to the colored troops in the war with Spain. The 8th Illinois only lacked the opportunity to make for Illinois as glorious a record as the cavalry and infantry troops achieved at Santiago. Its name will be enshrined, nevertheless, with the deeds of those daring men, and will sustain the record for unflinching duty and hardihood for which the pace was set by the famous 54th Massachusetts Regiment of the Civil War. Illinois had companies of colored soldiers in the 29th United States Colored Troops, which fought in the Civil War, but the departure of the 8th Illinois for the front marked the representation of the prairie state for the first time in any war by a full colored regiment in the government service, or any other state. The 8th was recruited mostly from Chicago, and it also represented all sections of the state, especially in the populous section of the southern part. The 9th Battalion, Chicago, which performed faithful service for the state for years, was the nucleus of the 8th Illinois Regiment. The first apportionment of regiments from the state militia to be called out under the call for 125,000 volunteers did not include the colored boys, but when the first call came to the state the colored regiment was already in formation, and prepared to answer the call to the front. With amazing rapidity the companies were created and filled to the necessary complement. But the impatient men were compelled to wait for the second call for volunteers, and were the first to be brought into the field under that call. They were prompt to respond. There were in the regiment when it left Chicago 1,500 men, from whom the full strength was selected. Companies A, B, C, D, E, and F were recruited in Chicago and made up from the old 9th Battalion. The remaining companies were enlisted from Bloomington, Springfield, Quincy, Litchfield, Mound City, and Cairo. The departure of the regiment from Chicago saw an outpouring of the entire colored population of the city to see their friends and relatives off to the front. The 6 companies from Chicago took cars to Springfield, where they went into the field under tents and were encamped beside the 9th Illinois, which was the other regiment called out under the second proclamation. The regiment was in the state fair grounds nearly 2 weeks before it was mustered into the Federal service. On July 13th the oath was taken to defend the flag and obey their superior officers. The muster roll showed 1,195 men and 76 officers. Called to Cuba. The Illinois colored soldiers went to Cuba in response to an emergency call. News came through a cable to Governor Tanner from the colonel commanding the 1st Regiment Illinois Volunteers. He implored Governor Tanner to do all he could to call the 1st Regiment from Cuba and thus avert a calamity. Governor Tanner immediately called Colonel Marshall of the 8th and his officers to a conference and asked if they were willing to go to the front. They made a quick response that they were both willing and ready. Thereupon the governor sent the following telegram: Springfield, Illinois, August 4. H.C. Corbin, Adjutant General, Washington, D.C. I called the officers of the 8th Illinois, colored, in conference, and they are unanimously and enthusiastically in favor of being sent to relieve the 1st Illinois at Santiago. Washington, August 5. Governor Tanner, Springfield, Illinois. The Secretary appreciates very much the offer of the 8th Illinois Volunteer Infantry for duty in Santiago, and has directed that the regiment be sent there on steamer Yale, leaving New York next Tuesday. The main trouble with our troops now in Cuba is that they are suffering from exhaustion and exposure, incident to one of the most trying campaigns to which soldiers have ever been subjected. H.C. Corbin, Adjutant General. That settled the question. Following close upon that came the message from the War Department, ordering the 8th Illinois Regiment to be in New York City in time to take the steamer Yale, which left Tuesday for Santiago. This did not leave much time for preparation, and as soon as the cars arrived the men were loaded and the start was made. The boys felt repaid for all the dangers they were daring by the demonstrations along the route from Springfield to New York. The regimental clerk wrote back, I suppose you know of our trip from Springfield to New York. The people, white and black, were very kind to us all along the route. When passing through Greenfield, Chillicothe, and Athens, Ohio, our train was halted by citizens, and splendid lunches were given to us, without money and without price. Along with the lunches came kind words of encouragement and beautiful flowers. These manifestations of regard made us feel that we were having a part of our reward in advance. Those good people can never know how their actions inspired us and strengthened us for the hardships that we have seen since that trip." They arrived in New York 2 men short, Private George Wall and Private Charles Ambrose of Company F, Captain W.B. Ackers. They accidentally fell off the train and were too badly injured to proceed. August 11 they left New York City for Santiago de Cuba, taking passage on the steamer Yale. They did not have a picnic on the way over by any means. The quartermaster of each company, not having a good place to cook for his men, could not give them the food they needed. They suffered greatly for water. All that was furnished was very warm, a poor makeshift for a thirsty man. They used to kick about Chicago water, but they would have given a good deal for a drink of lake water on the Yale. Some of the boys paid some waiters 25 cents for a drink of ice water. The cooler was in the dining room, but under heavy guard. One man paid $1 for 3 cups of coffee. They had a very smooth voyage, steaming about 15 or 20 knots an hour. For the next 2 days there was nothing of especial interest, being out on the open sea, with nothing in sight but the sky above and the blue sea below. Saturday afternoon they sighted San Salvador. Sunday noon the beautiful, verdant hills of Cuba burst upon the view, and for the rest of the day the Cuban coast was in full view. In Santiago Harbor. All enjoyed the sight of land and the prospects of a quick landing. The reception, which was royal, is thus described by one of the company officers. "We dropped anchor in Santiago Bay just as the sun was setting. We are now in waters historic for evermore. Above us, sullen and rugged, frowns the Morro, now dismantled. All around us is the now placid water, upon whose bosom took place the naval battle which sealed the fate of the Spanish government in the Western world. From the highest point of the Morro, an American sentinel, with the stars and stripes waving, cheered our boys, and our band responded by playing the Star-Spangled Banner. It was an inspiring sight which can never be effaced from my memory. The flagstaff and upper deck of the Spanish cruiser, Reina Mercedes, was in full view just inside of the bay, where she was sunk. A little further in, and in full view, could be seen the flagstaff of the Merrimac. Among such surroundings we rested for the night. The next forenoon the lighters came out of the bay to take us up to Santiago. It took quite a half day to transfer the regiment and supplies. About 3 o'clock we entered the channel. Again the American sentinel from the heights above waved the stars and stripes and cheered as we passed in. The band responded by playing America. We disembarked at Santiago about 5 o'clock Tuesday, August 16. The first night's experience in Cuba was at Santiago. The men camped in a graveyard. As soon as they surveyed the ground, their admiration for Uncle Sam's boys rose beyond expression. It was a mystery as to how all the United States soldiers ever landed. The place was full of blockhouses, trenches, breastworks, etc., built by the Spaniards, and they really looked impregnable. We found the Cubans to be hard bargain drivers. They were worse than the Spaniards, for they charged double price for everything. Colonel Marshall had a Cuban woman make him a pitcher of coffee. He furnished the coffee, and she furnished the water and the fire. She charged him 50 cents. August the 8th came one of the first honors of the 8th. Colonel Marshall was appointed governor of San Luis. At first great anxiety was manifested on all sides for the health of the colored soldiers. The fever which had so decimated the ranks of the first regiment was certain to attack the newcomers. Fortunately, the rainy season was nearly over, and the 8th suffered but little." Colonel Marshall's letter. "Our regiment is getting along nicely, and as for discipline and proficiency, I will stake it against any other volunteer regiment that was ever mustered, although reports have gone out to the contrary. There was no truth in the report that we were lawless and undisciplined. No regiment ever acted better than the 8th Illinois, and when the Inspector General arrived from Santiago to investigate the regiment, we were surprised, for we knew nothing of the report until then, and the investigation proved to be a libel. I assure you that the officers and men are on their guard, since we recognize the fact that the colored officers are on trial. The men have proved for years that they are made of all wool and a yard wide. Our success is theirs, and that of the whole race. If we fail, the whole race will have to shoulder the burden. We have a good many sick. The morning report showed 161, 90% malarial fever. We have lost 5 men since we left New York by death. 2 died last week. The climate is very hard on the men. We have fared no better than other regiments that preceded us, but the deaths have been fewer. One regiment now, the 9th Immunes, colored, from New Orleans, 1,000 strong, that arrived since we came, has over 80% of its men sick. Talk about immunes. There is no such thing. They are in a bad plight. They will not average 15 men to the company for duty. I am glad to know that we are not forgotten. We should not be, for we are facing a monster more fatal than Spanish bullets in a climate that is filled with fever, with no nourishments for the sick but rice and canned soups. Chickens are $1 apiece, eggs are 75 cents per dozen, fresh meats we never see. Bacon and hardtack every meal, poor water, and no ice. How I'd like to see the Armour Avenue Iceman tonight. The money raised should be used in buying nourishments for the sick. Then, if there is any left, forward here to buy some things that would not keep or stand the trip without spoiling. Our surgeons are worked very hard, but they are doing all they can for the sick. I visit the hospital every day and speak encouragingly to each man. I have had excellent health myself, but I may be taken down any day, because it looks like every man must get his share of it. We were very lucky that we were sent away from Santiago. It was death to stay there. You had to eat your dinner under a mosquito bar to keep the flies out of your food. The stench was worse than the Chicago River at the stockyards." One of the most perplexing problems which threatened the colored soldiers was the question of officers. In the regular service the officers on the commissioned staff were all white. It had always been contended that while the colored soldiers were brave, they would fight best under white officers, but this the colored soldiers would not admit, and several volunteer companies in different states resigned rather than accept white officers. When the Eighth was mustered into the service, the experiment was given a trial, for every officer from corporal to colonel was colored. What the ultimate result will be remains to be seen, but thus far reports have been favorable. The men of the Eighth realize that they are on trial, and they act accordingly. Dr. Curtis, first lieutenant and company surgeon, wrote home, "We appreciate the interest which all Chicago people manifest in our boys, who are now patriot exiles from their great state. None of our friends needs have any fear about the Eighth. She is all right. The reputation of the regiment is safe from the general commanding the division down. All regard the Eighth as an exceptional regiment. Our boys perform every duty assigned to them with promptness and in a manner that has uniformity and has solicited favorable comment from the general. Colonel Marshall is held in high esteem by all the officers and men. He is a good commander and has his regiment well in hand. We have had no trouble in maintaining discipline. The statement heretofore made that colored officers could not command colored soldiers will never be made again. If it is, our only reply will be to point to the Eighth, and to examine her records as kept in the imperishable archives of the War Department. This will show that there was as little trouble in maintaining discipline in the Eighth Regiment as in any regiment in the government service, regular or volunteer. At times we all feel like being at home, but we enlisted for 2 years, and each soldier in our ranks resolutely says, "My services the government wants for that length of time. I will answer call every morning for 2 years. Nay, more, after that, if Uncle Sam should need a well-disciplined regiment to protect his interests in our new territories, whether Cuba, Puerto Rico, or Manila. All that he needs to do is to call the Eighth and we'll answer." We realize the fact that we are making history for our race, and we are willing to make the sacrifice. God knows I would give a month's salary to see my wife and children today. But sacrifice is sweetened by the consolation which comes when duty is faithfully done. We propose to make such good soldiers of our men that no American can ever say again that the American negro is unworthy the uniform of the United States Army, whether it be the ordinary blue of a private grandly and silently walking his post at night, or the colonel with plumed helmet and drawn saber, proudly riding at the head of a magnificent regiment. The health of the regiment is fairly good. Malarial fever is the principal sickness." Marrying Cuban Girls. The usual good nature of the colored boys is shown in Cuba as well as at home. They are adapting themselves to circumstances. Unable to bask in the sunshine of their home girls, they are playing Romeo to Cuban Juliets. Several of the Eighth have taken Cuban wives, and "still there are more to follow." A letter from Harry McCard, hospital steward. "Afro-American Cuban wedding, which occurred Thanksgiving Day. The crowning happiness came to 2 boys in Company F about 2 weeks ago, when they were married to 2 beautiful señoritas of the pale-face and long-haired variety. The wedding, which was a double one, took place in a small grass-roofed house, and was quite as pretty as it was odd. Neither of the grooms could speak or understand a complete sentence in the language of the brides, who in turn could hardly speak a word of English. The services of an interpreter of course were required, and after the boys were married, they were well married, for the city mayor, the city judge, and the chief of police all took a hand in the ceremony. 2 new firesides have been set up, and the young people seem to be living very happily indeed. I know several more who are preparing for the same important step, strange as it may seem. Harry McCard. One of the Boys pleads. One of the boys pleads his company guilty of foraging for chicken and shote. He says that while he did not want to complain, he thought it was only fair to say they had seen trouble sometimes in the commissary department. They were especially anxious for the sick boys, who suffered considerably for food. While they were waiting for improvements in supplies, it was generally conceded that the pig or chicken that had more curiosity than good judgment never lived to repeat the experiment. Assigned to duty. The soldiers began active provost duty as soon as they reached Cuba. The regiment landed at Santiago Wharf, marched about a mile from town through deep mud and water, and camped overnight. The next day the 1st Battalion, under command of Lieutenant Colonel Johnson, boarded the train for San Luis, arriving at 4:30, and camped around the depot. August 19th, 2nd and 3rd Battalions arrived in San Luis, with Colonel Marshall in command, camping about 1 mile from town with 3 companies of the 1st Battalion, A, B, and C. August 24th, 2 companies of the 2nd Battalion, C and F, with Major Jackson in command, marched about 30 miles from San Luis to Palma, and were stationed to do duty at that place. Captain R. P. Root had command of Company E, while Captain W. B. Ackers had Company F. Colonel Marshall, with the major part of the regiment, remained at San Luis. All were expected to remain there until called home. It is a much more desirable place than the campgrounds at Santiago. In the first report of the latter place, Colonel Marshall said, I arrived here with 1,195 enlisted men and 76 officers. We have 8 men sick. We camped on the battlefield about 2 miles out. Dead Spanish soldiers are being buried and burned on the hill about a quarter of a mile from us. Others are buried all over the place. It has rained ever since we arrived. At San Luis conditions are completely changed. The town is well governed, and a thorough renovation of the city has resulted from the reforms instituted by the soldiers. At first the mud and filth was intolerable, but that soon gave place to the order and cleanliness under the direction of the authorities. Chloride of lime was used extensively, and all garbage was burned. The health of the men improved rapidly, and the death rate has been remarkably low." A good report of the garrison work of the regiment is given by a New York correspondent of a New York paper. He said, "On arriving here I found the 8th Illinois a colored regiment officered by colored men entirely. So much has been said concerning colored men under colored officers, that they would not obey them, I was curious to know how the experiment would work. I secured a pass from Colonel Wood to pass the lines. Arriving at the camp, I asked to be taken to the colonel's tent. I found him an affable, pleasing military gentleman, unaffected by the grave responsibilities resting upon him, and void of that arrogance assumed by the average white officer. He detailed a sergeant of Company A, a graduate of the Chicago High School and member of the senior class of the Northwestern Law School, to accompany me through the camp. The cleanliness of the hospital tents especially attracted my attention. The surgeons in their snow-white jackets were flitting here and there, caring for the invalids, administering with their own hands medicines which it was the duty of the nurses to do, something I did not see done by white surgeons on board the transports. The kitchen arrangements were the best I have seen since the war began. Each company has a large porcelain vessel in which boiled water is kept for drinking purposes. Every possible sanitary precaution has been taken by the thoughtful officers to avoid disease, and it is safe to say that there are fewer men sick in this than any other regiment in the volunteer army. The guardhouse contained 7 men who had visited the canteen too often or frequently. In the tents of more than half the men could be found a Bible, and regardless of what may have been said to the contrary, the men of the 8th Illinois, as a rule, are as orderly and gentlemanly as any regiment in the service. A dress parade that evening, which was ordered in honor of an English army officer visiting the camp, the men presented a splendid appearance. They have mastered the intricacies of the drill. Their even military movement is a thing of beauty. Each soldier prides himself on keeping his uniform and equipment bright. The Englishman was surprised when the captain showed him that not a speck of dirt adhered to his white gloves, which he passed over and in the muzzle of a soldier's gun. The Young Men's Christian Association of Chicago has spread a tent here, in which the boys congregate to write home, read the daily papers, and play games, no cards. They are all healthy and happy. The man who thinks the negro will not obey officers of his race has but to visit the camps of the 8th Illinois. There being no prejudice here on account of a man's color, the negro soldier is treated the same as other soldiers are. In fact, there seems to be a preference on the part of the white women for the boys. Some of them are magnificent specimens of manhood. And if the provost guard isn't very strict, a few of the 8th Illinois boys will be left in Cuba as the husbands of planters' daughters." Glimpse of the future. It is generally conceded that some of the 8th Illinois boys are in Cuba to stay. The country suits them so far as climate is concerned, and the civil and political advantages are certain to attract aspiring and capable colored men. Word has already come that colored soldiers are making investments. Captain Waller and Captain Akers have closed a deal for a coffee farm. One of the enthusiastic soldiers home on a furlough says, "The right kind of a man can make a fortune on this island, by George. The natives use the real mahogany wood for kindling fires. The Cuban don't know the value of the stuff. A man could make a fortune off that alone. Now about the school question. There are no schools at present. The government is making preparation to start the schools in the near future. The religion is strictly Catholic. I like the country fine, and in my estimation it is just the place for the colored man. There is no discrimination in Cuba. Everybody looks alike. Many express themselves as wanting to stay here if they get mustered out here. When Uncle Sam establishes a government in Cuba, it will be the place for young lawyers, doctors, and professors. They will have a great field before them. Our politicians will have a chance to display some of their ability, and our ministers need not complain. Colored carpenters, blacksmiths, bricklayers, in fact all mechanics, can find employment." When the men of the 8th Illinois come marching home, they will be greeted like soldiers who went forth to battle and returned victoriously. They bore hardships like soldiers, and although now and then there were murmurs, the great body of them readily resigned themselves to the unavoidable hardships in the field. The evident decision of the government to keep the 8th Illinois in Cuba on garrison duty this winter is proof of its good behavior and soldierly qualities. The Chicago Evening Post. End of Chapter 8 of The 8th Illinois by W.T. Good.